I'll give a quick reminiscence. 30 years ago, Crease existed in 2 rooms in the second floor of the history department, not even contiguous. We had, I think, a part-time secretary. I had a desk that had most of the property of the center in it, paper clips, some extra paper, stapler. And one day, October 17th, 30 years ago, I was on duty at 5:04 p.m. Note, by the way, Norman, I was working overtime when there was the Loma Prieta earthquake, and I single-handedly saved the property of Crease. I dived under the desk, and for some reason, it seemed to be a priority to save the paper clips and the stapler and so on. The main drawer of the desk kept opening and shutting, and I was underneath it, and I kept shutting it. Somehow it seemed a priority to not let the paper clips spill out onto the floor. So I single-handedly saved Crease at that moment. Our first speaker today is Bert Patenaude. Bert is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's also a lecturer in history and international relations at Stanford. His most recent book is Defining Moments, the First 100 Years of the Hoover Institution. He's also author of Trotsky, Downfall of a Revolutionary, 2009, HarperCollins, and A Wealth of Ideas, Revelations from the Hoover Institution Archives, Stanford University Press, 2006. His book reviews regularly appear in the Wall Street Journal. He received his PhD in history from Stanford, where he studied with Professor Alexander Dahlan. Bert will talk about the Hoover Library, the Stanford History Department, and the foundations of Crease. Bert.
Thank you, Jeff. I'll take that.
Yes.
Okay. So let's go back. You're seeing the slides to come. So I'm going to talk to you about the foundations of Crease, sort of the origins, the backstory. This, some of you already recognize, the first Crease Steering Committee, 1918. Just checking, some of the grad students, I think, didn't get that. So this is a poster from the Hoover Archives. And as Jack said, or as you would have gotten from Jack's introduction, it's the Hoover centennial year as well. And I'm just going to sort of start with that and build up the Hoover element on campus that will lead into and feed into the early part of Crease's history. Most of you know that Hoover begins, the Hoover Institution begins when Herbert Hoover sends a telegram from Paris, April 1919. He's with the American delegation to negotiate peace. And the telegram comes to campus, and there is a message in it directed to a Stanford history professor named Ephraim Adams. And essentially what Hoover is saying is, I've got $50,000, let's start a collection on the Great War. That collection, initially called the Hoover War Collection, within a few years it's the Hoover War Library. And the key point here is that in the early years, Hoover collectors, directors, curators, and so on are history department faculty. So Adams is the first director. He enlists his student, Stanford graduate, PhD in European history, a specialist on Germany, a man by the name of Ralph Lutz, a name some of you may know. Lutz eventually succeeds Adams as director of Hoover in 1925. Lutz gets credit for a memorable collecting trip in 1919 through Central Europe, and that begins the great Hoover collections on Central Europe. But it's this guy that we want to focus on for a few moments, who really sort of is a key figure in the run-up to Crease. And this is Frank Golder, photo that down there in the lower left. He is sent over to Europe in 1920. He is enlisted by Adams to teach in the history department and also to be a collector-curator for Hoover. Golder goes over in 1920. He's got a sort of general roving commission to collect books, periodicals, manuscripts for Hoover. He's primarily involved in collecting in the Baltic states and gets some very good stuff there, but he's itching to get into Soviet Russia. Golder was born there. He's actually born just outside of Odessa. Family leaves after the pogrom sparked by the assassination of Alexander II, so he ends up in Germany and then in the States. Golder has been to Russia, pre-Soviet Russia, 1914, 1917. So he knows the terrain, Golder does, the pre-Soviet terrain. And he gets lucky in the summer of 1921. There's a massive famine in Soviet Russia, 1921-22. And Herbert Hoover's American Relief Administration goes in to fight that famine. Golder goes in with them. He's a member of one of the first parties. This is Golder's ARA passport here, which is in his papers in the Hoover archives. Golder will be in Soviet Russia for most of the next 21 months. And this, I would argue, is his great achievement as a scholar, as a collector. His most important professional accomplishment, what he collects on modern Russian history and early Soviet history while he's there in 1921-23. Thanks to Golder, Hoover's collections from that time on have been unsurpassed in the West. Books, periodicals, complete runs of newspapers and journals, which he's provided by the Soviet establishment. Most official publications since 1917, private papers, including diaries, one of which will be published in the 1980s, the diary of a Moscow historian, Yuri Gautier. And he also collects posters, which is kind of unusual at the time. You know, people wondered why they were collecting such artifacts. And of course, Hoover's poster collection today is one of its sort of hallmarks. Now, from the beginning, there's a big debate inside Hoover. We talk about this in this new book, Defining Moments, about the scope of this war library's collecting. How much do you need in the run-up to the war, and how much do you need in the aftermath? In 1923, Herbert Hoover gives his blessing to allowing the collecting to go on into the so-called Reconstruction period after the war. But the question really doesn't go away, because when does the Reconstruction period end? In 1925, they do set, and now they mean it, a firm closing date of 1925, although it's not really rigidly adhered to. But Russia is the exception. There's no capping the collecting on Russia when it comes to Hoover collecting. Really impossible to set limits. And it's, in fact, the wildfire expansion of Hoover's collections in through the 1920s on late imperial and Soviet Russia that served to encourage the library to collect more broadly in other areas. Now, testimony to the uniqueness of Hoover's Russia collections comes in 1925. How many of you know this? In 1925, the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial Fund awarded a grant to Stanford, $25,000 to establish something called the Russian Revolution Institute. It's the first award by an American foundation for Russian studies. No other university would get such an award until after World War II. Now keep in mind, this is a Stanford Institute. It's not a Hoover Institute. We don't yet have that division Hoover-Stanford that will come in and that I'll demonstrate for you, illustrate for you shortly. So if you go to the Stanford annual reports in the 1920s, 1930s, you see this as a standalone area whose progress is discussed year in, year out, the Russian Revolution Institute. A brief mention of one other figure, of one of the directors from this period, a man named Harold Fisher. So large were the records of Hoover's relief organizations, the American Relief Administration in particular, that they actually brought Harold Fisher from New York to Stanford to serve as curator of those collections. And he's also, by the way, affiliated with the history department. So he's there from 1924 and will succeed Ralph Lutz in 1943 and become director of the Hoover Institution. Now, there's one other guy I need to mention. And, you know, in my publications on the Hoover Institution, I haven't been too kind to this person, meaning I've kind of ignored him. There was a man who served as curator of Hoover's Russia collections beginning in 1924, a Russian emigre, trained as a lawyer in late Imperial Russia, Dmitry Krasovsky. And Krasovsky comes out of Imperial Russia and ends up getting a degree in library science from UC Berkeley. And he's appointed the first Hoover curator for its Russia collections, and that will last up to 1947. Hoover also enlisted in the cause of collecting so-called acquisitions agents, usually referred to in the Hoover correspondence as special agents. And the most outstanding of these special agents was a distinguished Russian emigre, military historian living in Paris by the name of Nicholas Golovin, a former Russian army general. Hired by Hoover in 1926, he begins right away securing the papers of white Russians living in Europe, papers dealing mostly with Russian military history, First World War, and the Civil War of 1918 to 1921, but also he's collecting documents on the various activities of the Russian emigration, particularly in Europe. It's Golovin who plays the central role in securing for Hoover the files of the Paris branch of the Russian Imperial Secret Police. I see heads nodding. This is good. It's the Okhrana. Should be Okranka, but somehow known in the West as the Okhrana collection. And the story, very briefly, France grants diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union in 1924, and when it does, it's obligated to turn over to the Soviet Union the former Russian embassy building and all of its contents. The last Russian ambassador to France before the Bolsheviks come in 1917 is Vasily Maklakov. He's caretaker of the building. He persuades the Soviets, he lies, that he had destroyed the entire records of the Paris branch of the Okhrana. In fact, he had them quietly moved to a safe location. It was Golovin who persuaded Maklakov to have those files shipped secretly to Stanford. 18 wooden crates, each weighing more than 500 pounds. They arrive on campus in 1926, and actually they're stored in secret in the basement of the Stanford Museum, today the Cantor, until the Hoover Tower is built in 1941, and then they're put secretly at the top of the tower. Maklakov had a contract that said, this collection must remain secret for 30 years, kept under seal. After 30 years came up, he was still alive. He hadn't counted on that. So he renegotiated the deal. They will stay sealed until 3 months after my death. He died in July of 1957. That October, and this is the scene here, the seals on the crates are broken, and this makes huge national headlines. The person standing there is Witold Swarakovsky, taking inventory. He was the guy who succeeded Krasovsky in 1947, so he's curator for Russia and Eastern Europe. He's a Polish emigre, and he's brought in part because of Hoover's acquisition of those phenomenal Polish collections at the end of World War II. They need somebody who knows his way around these papers. So that brings Swarakovsky to Hoover. Later, when the area specialization of the curators becomes more refined, he's Polish curator, but also associate director of the Hoover Institution. Swarakowski's nickname is Swara. Everybody called him that. Formidable collector, formidable bibliographer. Most impressively, he acquired the library of Boris Nikolaevsky, the European Socialist Revolutionary Movements, and on communism. Arguably the single most important holding on Russia in the Hoover archives. The bulk of that collection came to Hoover in 1963, but there were significant additions that came later after Swara was gone. Nikolaevsky, Norman knows this, came to Hoover to serve as curator of his collection. Now, Swarakowski wrote the first published survey of Hoover's Russian East European collection. That came out in 1954. That report was read by the guy on the right. Who's that? Yeah, it's Alexander Kerensky, so leader of the Provisional Government in 1917. He was living in exile in New York City. He read this report. Swarakowski challenged the common assumption that there were no records of the Provisional Government. Hoover had plenty of it, Swarakowski maintained. That drew Kerensky to come to Stanford campus. Came out summer of 1955 to have a look, planned to stay for 2 weeks, stayed for 2 months, and realized that he would have to come back. Hoover invited him to come back to edit a series of these documents for publication. So he returned in 56 and stayed for several years. And he ends up co-editing a multi-volume collection, 3 volumes, documents in English translation on the Provisional Government, published by Stanford University Press, 1961. Now, Kerensky would end up coming back to campus, and he would teach in the history department. Wince, I can see some people wincing, that's fine. 1965, 66, one of his seminar students was Norman Neymark. Someday he'll tell us about that. Kerensky returned to campus in 1967 for this blockbuster conference on campus sponsored by Hoover. The leading figures in the field were here on campus. Quite an event. Bertram Wolfe, by then a Hoover Fellow, was here. Louis Foyer, Klaus Maynard, Gregory Grossman, Ivo Lederer, John Hazard, Max Hayward, Gleb Struve, Raymond Gartoff, Leonard Shapiro, Philip Mosley, Sidney Hook. I could go on. What an event. One of the people who did not present at that conference, but who was a participant, who was there in the discussion, was Wayne Vucinich. Now, Swarakowski retired in 1969, and that opened the door for Uncle Wayne to become part of this Hoover-Stanford story. He had arrived at Stanford in 1946, came to teach Western civilization. In the 1970s, and it's a short period of time, December of 1974 till 77, Wayne Vucinich is half-time curator of the East European collection. It's a short stint, but it inspires him to start a project, a publication series, Studies of Nationalities in the USSR, published by Hoover Press. The first volume of which appears in 1978, The Crimean Tatars. Some of us know this series, still very, very valuable series. So Uncle Wayne's the director of Crease from 1972 to 85. Norman will talk about that. But I want to focus for one moment on Wayne Vucinich's connection to Swarakowski, because all roads at that time, if you wanted to do anything in Polish East European history, all roads passed through Swarakowski's office. And there's correspondence in the Hoover archives. Have a look at this. So Uncle Wayne taught, I hope you can, it's kind of small there, but I hope you can see some of the language there. I'll read from it in a moment. Uncle Wayne taught at 3 Stanford overseas campuses, Florence, Beutelsbach, near Stuttgart, and Vienna. Now have a look at this letter, May 16, 1961. He's in Beutelsbach. He had just spent fall and winter quarter in Florence, and then came to Beutelsbach. But a group of students went to the Soviet Union. They got in a little trouble, maybe a little adventure. It says here the material from the Soviet Union, it's about a factory, was thrust into their hands by a desperate Russian. I like the way Wayne says, it's hard to say whether the man who gave them the documents is normal or insane. And he's examined them, doesn't know what to do with them. It could be valuable intelligence. May I send them to you? And Swarovsky would end up saying yes. Now, who were these students? If you look down here, when they returned to campus, the 4 students involved, Smith, Kennedy, Page, Weinstein, the Kennedy is David Kennedy. So when I found this letter, I had to ask him about this. Was it the romantic adventure, the Cold War espionage saga that we expect you to write up into some kind of, novelistic treatment? No, David said it was a wacko scheme to smuggle out a manuscript concerning a Soviet manufacturing facility. He was the guy who took the lead in this. And when he got back to Stanford, he walked into Swarovsky's office, his moment of triumph. Not. He writes, this is a quote from David, I expected to be greeted like a Cold War hero, but Swarovsky's first words to me were, you are a very foolish young man. Anyway, opera bouffe is the way David terms it. Now, one other letter, and then I'll finish. We go back to 1949. It's December 22. Swarovsky also had an exchange at that time with a very young Alexander Dahlin. Sorry, this is cut off. It's not on my screen. Alex, very recognizable signature down there. He had written a paper as a grad student at Columbia on Russo-Polish relations during World War I. He wanted Swarovsky's opinion. Typical Alex, even when he was 25 years old, he's already saying, I've run across several serious factual errors I made since I finished the paper. Thus, your criticism is very kind. I quite agree with your remarks and only feel that you are not severe enough. I mean, this just, for people who knew Alex, this sounds like Alex, right? So this is 1949. In December, he took his doctoral exams the following spring. In 1953, finished his PhD. Now, this is the daily clip. This I think you can see, January 8, 1968. Would this be the time that Alex came to the Stanford campus for the first time? Might well be. You see why he's coming out. There's a lecture, Soviet Foreign Policy Since Khrushchev. It's by an authority on this subject, and it's Professor Dahlin, and it's part of a conference, I think, East European Week, by East European faculty seminar headed by Professor Wayne Fusenich. So that's 1968. And then in 1971, Alex comes out for good. Now, what a lot of people don't remember is that Alex, when he arrived here, it was really Hoover that drew him out to the campus. He was sick and tired of campus radicalism at Columbia at the time. A year earlier, campus radicalism was pretty bad here. But he comes out in 1971. His salary is half Hoover, half history. Salary split 50-50. I took this image from the History Department newsletter of 1971. There's actually a section in the newsletter, as there was throughout the 70s, devoted to the Hoover Institution. So having this kind of 50-50 split wasn't such a big deal. Incidentally, in this issue, they mentioned the first crop of something brand new, Hoover National Fellows. There were 2 from the History Department. David Kennedy, he's back, and Dorothy Atkinson. So David's subject was World War I and American society. We know where that will lead to. And Dorothy's was the Russian land commune. Now look, when Alex arrives, he's moving politically to the left. If Alex were here, he would do his, left, right, what's left, what's right kind of thing. He would sort of question this, but he definitely was. While Hoover is moving a bit further to the right in the 1970s. So after a time, Alex had had enough with Hoover politics, and he would quit Hoover. In the spring of 1978, he's able to do this because Ivo Lederer, who had been at Stanford teaching in the history department since 1965, retired in 1977. So Alex comes in and starts teaching the Soviet period. And this, by the way, is when there's a kind of exclusive delineation of pre-1917 and Soviet period. That's what Alex wanted. Meanwhile, oh, here he is. He'll be back in a moment. My last slide. There's this guy, Terry Emmons. He was my advisor. He's in the history department, teaches Imperial Russian history. He began teaching in 1965 together with Ivo Lederer. Anatole Mazur retired that year, 1964. And it was Lederer and Emmons coming in was a kind of 2-for-1. It's an indication of the rising significance of Russian-Soviet studies in the early 1960s. I'm showing you this because I want you to know that Terry Emmons was also at Hoover during the 1970s. He was the editor, as you see here, of Russian Review, and Russian Review was based at the Hoover Institution. 1973 to 1983, it gave an office to Russian Review, paid for a secretary. I got this image out of the 1975 Hoover Annual Report. Okay, before Jack gets the hook out, I will leave this slide up of these two giants and leave it to my colleagues to come in and talk about it.
Sit up there, Jack.
Gee, thank you, Bert. That was really informative. I think all of us learned some things. Norman Neymark is the Robert and Florence McDonald Professor of East European Studies in the History Department, a senior fellow of the Hoover Institution and of the Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies. Norman formerly served as the director of the Stanford Global Studies Division, the director of the Bing Overseas Studies Program, and director of Crease from '89 to '92, and again from '94 to '95. Norman received his BA, MA, and PhD from Stanford, where he studied with Uncle Wayne Vucinich. He is author of numerous books on genocide, a very heavy topic, and 20th century Eastern Europe, most recently Stalin and the Fate of Europe, the post-war struggle for sovereignty, which came out this month from Harvard University Press. He will talk about the magic of Uncle Wayne.
I'm deeply honored to be asked to talk about Uncle Wayne, as we all called him. His friends, even his colleagues, older colleagues, students all call him Uncle, and so that's what I'll call him here. Everyone who encountered him knows that his biography doesn't really do it, but I'm going to give you a quick once over the biography and then try to identify some of these aspects of his magic that I called it. I won't talk about his work today. I mean, that's, you can't do that. Can't do everything in a talk, but if somebody wants to talk about his scholarship, we can do that as well. So very quickly, he was born in Montana in 1913 of Herzegovinian Serb parents. They were miners, or his father was a miner and had come from Herzegovina to work in the mines. His parents died tragically in the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. And the extended family, which basically looked after him and his brother and sister, decided to send him back to Yugoslavia in 1920, or not back, but to Yugoslavia in 1920. It was the first time he went, right, as a 7-year-old. Where, he went to school in the village, in the home village of Bilica Rudina in Herzegovina. Then the family decided in 1929, the coming of the Depression came earlier to Europe than it came here, to send him back to the United States. So he went to Los Angeles, where he went to high school. He was big, strapping, strong, as a, son of a Herzegovinian miner would be. And so he won a football scholarship to Berkeley. And at Berkeley, he he said he used to tell stories about how he could barely speak any English, and that kind of thing. But he managed to get through Berkeley just fine with his football and did well with the girls, which he always talked about. I'm sorry I have to say that. But he was also a very handsome man, as you can see from the picture, even as an older scholar. So from Berkeley, he ran into Robert Kerner, who was a famous Russianist, Slavicist at Berkeley, who took him under his wing. And Kerner sent him off in the 30s to Prague to study in Prague, which he fell in love with. But Prague at the end of the 30s was a tough place as Hitler was threatening. And so he came back to the United States, got his PhD at Berkeley. I think it was 1939. I'm not going to check the exact date, but 38 or 39, he got his PhD. He married Sally Stiss, the love of his life and the beloved wife and the wonderful woman. And then when the war came, he entered OSS. And like many of our professors, the first founding generation of our profession were in OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of CIA, for those of you who don't know. And he had many adventures in OSS. He was in Caserta in Italy, working with the Yugoslav partisans. He himself was a partisan of the partisans. He was pro-Tito. Eventually also was dropped into, parachuted into Bulgaria and did various things there. I found some wonderful pictures of him, which I can't find right now, which is too bad, at trials in Bulgaria at the end of the war. He came to Stanford in 1946 as a Western Civ instructor. He worked a little bit in the government. He didn't like the government very much, but he came to Stanford in 1946 as a Western Civ instructor. And that sort of began his Stanford career, where he stayed for the rest of his time, where he became, in the words of Ivo Banac, one of his students and a friend of mine, the Nestor of Balkan studies in the United States. In other words, he was the father of this branch of studies, and he was a fixture of the history department, certainly one of its greatest structural proponents of history in the history department. He was also, as Bert mentioned, involved with Hoover as a curator. He was a founding father of Crease, even though he wasn't its first director, who was Eva Lederer. And of course, he was the mentor of scores of Stanford undergraduates and graduate students, myself included. And I don't know if there's anybody else in the room, but people certainly knew him and knew what he was about. So I have to be really careful because it's far too easy. I love thinking about Uncle Wayne when I was sort of preparing this. It's far too easy to idealize him. Figures of the past, historians know this. We know it about our own parents, who we now idealize, right? He was not a saint, but for the purposes of this talk and for my own memory, he was certainly magical. He helped make Russian and East European studies at Stanford what it is today, which is something more than the sum of its parts. It's something special, and it's something worth preserving. And all of us, who had any contact with him knew that it was bigger than life itself, right? That it was more than just an academic enterprise. It was a commitment. It was something about the soul. So let me try to elaborate a few elements of his magic as I can. So as I mentioned, he was called Uncle by almost everyone, and in good measure because he was indeed our Serb uncle. And he acted like it. He was the head of a big clan of students, colleagues, and friends that resembled the Zadruga, or extended family, and communal, a life or organization unit in the Balkans. Actually, it goes back to Byzantium. He loved that family, every member of it, and he encouraged us to act as a family and to love and help each other, grow together, stand together. He was always open to new members. I mean, democratic with a low D was one of the words he liked to use. Men, women, minorities, Slavs, non-Slavs, it didn't really matter. Everyone was equal in this family, just as ostensibly in the Zadruga, though he clearly had his favorites whom he would never reveal. We didn't know. Also, like a Balkan clan, loyalty was demanded, and there were enemies on the outside. They were not as fierce and threatening as his brother and fellow scholar Alex Vucinic sometimes thought. Anybody who knew Alex, you must have known Alex, George, Alex really saw the enemies. I mean, Wayne did too, but he tried to keep that a little further down. But still, we stood together and we protected Stanford turf, and Berkeley was often included in that turf because of the kind of appointments back and forth and the contacts back and forth between them. We hired Terry Emmons from Berkeley. They hired Reggie Zelnick from Stanford. That was the kind of thing that you did in those days. He prayed for members of the Klan, as he did prior to my orals. He lent money to those who needed it, as he did to me, or he sent them off to Klan members in the administration who he had recruited to the Klan so that they could loan money, to needy graduate students, which was clear in those days that you needed it. He suffered when Klan members endured tragedies of one sort or another and took it very hard when couples broke up. He provided shelter, a bed, and a meal at the least sign of need. He lived back in the hills, and his house was always open, and, people knew they could sleep over there if they needed. He organized coffee sessions almost every morning for his graduate students and a few colleagues, where politics and scholarship were the main themes. Now, those of us now who have grown up and have become professors know that where do you get that time? Right? How are you able to do anything like that? When I became a professor myself, I wondered, tried to live up to some of what he did. I just, I couldn't do it. I mean, there just seemed to be no way. But there he was, morning after morning, often in Hoover, in the basement, telling stories, denouncing the government. He was a determined progressive, and acculturating us into academia. I mean, that was the goal of all this. And you needed to show up. Again, if you were part of this Zadruga, then it was more or less required that you be there at this coffee hour. So that's what we did. Through his sheer charisma, Uncle drew into Slavic studies a raft of people who had started in other fields, or folks like myself who had no idea what field they wanted to go into. To this day, I can remember, and it's been fun thinking about it, his undergraduate course on the Balkans, an area about which very few students knew anything at all, right? And all of a sudden, through his stories, you couldn't call them lectures, but through his stories, you were there. I mean, you were in the Balkan village. When the geese were going around, Jack and I would talk about this, they were going counterclockwise around the village because that's the way the people, walked in that village, while in the other village, the geese went the other way, and they, went clockwise in the other village, and then two villages fought against each other, and the geese fought against, you had it all. Also, the transhumance, which was a phenomenon that he was fascinated with. In the summer, the boys and the old men would go up in the mountains with the flocks. And it was a kind of wonderful kind of cultural practice that he was able to demonstrate to us. And again, most people are kind of middle-class American, boys and girls, and here he's talking about this cultural phenomenon about which, we knew nothing and had heard nothing. The last article he wrote, by the way, was about transhumance in his youth. So he remembered that as well. He recruited graduate students from all kinds of fields by convincing all of them that they really had something to contribute, which is pretty amazing. If they were from the region or if they spoke the language, there was no escape. He would grab them, much as Kerner had grabbed him, when he was at Berkeley. This kind of recruitment's impossible today given the costs and the restrictions of our fellowships, But at that time, we often started with sometimes quite large classes, 6, 7, 8 students, starting out in the Rush-East European field, meaning there were 20, 25 sometimes around, some with funding, some without, some surviving, some not surviving very well, but all eventually flourishing on the hope, the string of hope that Uncle Wayne held out there, that, we were all brilliant and we all had things to say. He wrote countless letters for us all. I mean, students ask me about letters. I never say no, because he wrote many, many, many more letters, and not just for people in his field, for people in other fields. And there was this fantastic woman, who some people remember, Elise Johnson, who was his secretary for many, many years, who actually typed all those letters. We suspected maybe she wrote the letters, but we don't know exactly. But he clearly dictated them. But Elise's job, and he deputized her, was to make sure we looked good for our interviews, and that we cut our hair, and that we didn't wear sandals. And I took that sort of personally. It was hard on me at that point. I don't know any professor before or since who fought so hard for his students. I mean, he just fought for every single student. We were all super. We were all versatile, which was his favorite adjective, meaning we could teach anything, right? And he would go out and sell us that way. And he was, by the way, both the formal and informal director of placement in the history department, because everybody else was, jealous of the fact that this guy was out there fighting for his students. He held a series of conferences at Stanford on a wide variety of themes. They had important intellectual content, usually resulted in edited volumes, but I'm convinced he did this in good part to expose his students to senior scholars, and he thought this was a good way, to get them out there and to get jobs. And I remember trying to figure out why it was that I was driving Hugh Seton Watson around the Bay Area to watch birds, when he visited Stanford. And I finally figured it out that, Uncle thought this was a way that would somehow help me get a job and get another recommendation from the most famous guy in the field I was working in. He took some of us to his home region itself on archaeological digs that he organized. What a treat it was, to walk around this village in the morning. And again, it's been wonderful to reminisce about this myself, because he would take us out, take me out about 5 o'clock in the morning, just when people were getting up in the village. The bakers were starting to bake, the peasants were going out into the field, and he'd talk to them, and if any of those you who remember, he would talk to anybody, but he really loved talking to peasants, and he never lost, his sense of the village, of simple folk, and the kind of dignity of their occupations, what they did, and he had great admiration for them and for that. Another piece of Uncle's magic had to do with the respect and fascination for, as well as understanding of, the smaller peoples of the region. Not just the Balkans, but the entire Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and not just Christian peoples, but Buddhists, Jews, animists, and especially Muslim peoples. He was way ahead of his time in this regard. He was dedicated to the understanding of Byzantium, Ottoman Empire, Turkic empires spread across Central Asia. I mean, he had a huge, and if you think about it, sometimes fantastic breadth of interest, not just interest, but also competence. Bert has mentioned he edited a series at Hoover Institution Press on the nationalities of the Soviet Union, the first of its kind in the literature. He was not a nationalist, just the opposite. I think he was kind of modern-day Herder, who saw in all of these people something really wonderful to preserve their language, their culture, their individuality. It was one of the hardest parts of his life, by the way, to witness the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. I had come back to Stanford already as a faculty member, and I was with him, during the 90s when a lot of this happened. And this was really, really hard on him, even though, again, he respected the individuality of Croats, Serbs, Bosnian Muslims, and so on. To see the breakup of Yugoslavia and the fratricidal killing that went with it, I think was extremely, really hard on him. Respect for difference and cultural autonomy ran deep in his soul. In Uncle's magical world, Vlachs, gypsies, Lusatian Sorbs, were every bit as important as Germans or Russians, and much more interesting. I mean, that was his world, where these smaller peoples, were to be respected and studied. Finally, and I'm going to leave it at this today, Uncle's magic reached well beyond the immediate vicinity of the History Department and the Center for Russian and East European Studies. He was a pioneer at Stanford Travel Study, shepherding Stanford alums, up and down the Danube, sometimes 4 times a summer. I think once he did it 6 times. Regaling them with stories about the region, much as he did his students. He was known to dance Balkan dances, and those of us who have seen him dance his dance, he had a little white kerchief, and he would swing around doing these dances and sing beautifully. I mean, a beautiful voice, traditional songs from his region. He would drink late in the night with passengers and talk to them about Eastern Europe. Again, when I came back to Stanford, I tried to emulate him a little bit, but it just didn't work. First of all, I don't like drinking, and I don't like staying up late at night. And so on these trips, which I do like, he would manage to, entice people into this world, through his really socializing with him. They really loved him, and he loved the performance of it all. But there was also a method to the dancing and the singing and the drinking, and that was to raise money for Russian and East European Studies at Stanford, which he did, both in the History Department and for Crease, which he directed from 1972 until 1983. He personally raised the funds for the McDonald Chair, which he was the inaugural holder of, and which I now hold. And his circles of friends, acquaintances, donors reached deep into the Stanford alumni group, but also into the Slavic community in California. And a lot of them, were Yugoslav emigres, but they just called themselves Slavs. They didn't worry about Croats or Serbs or that at that point. He seemed to know every Orthodox church in this state, both Russian and Serbian, and even Greek. And he seemed to know every Yugoslav family who lived here. And there was a purpose again. There was, he loved doing this. He loved the contacts. But he also was trying to attract, attention to the field and money to the field at Stanford. I continue, I have to say, to be astounded at the numbers of people I meet from various backgrounds, academic and not, who had succumbed to Uncle's magic, and who remember him, although fewer and fewer personally, to this day. His friends and devotees were and still are everywhere. Thank you.
I think all of us of a certain age have our own memories stimulated by Norman's references to Uncle Wayne. One set of memories I have is in the early 1980s, Nancy and I accompanied a Stanford travel study group that was a boat cruise on the Volga. We also did a little Golden Ring cities visit. It was inspirational to be with Uncle Wayne on that ship and watch him working the crowd late at night. In those days, we had to bring along with us fold-out maps, and we were he was lecturing on the boat, and we were holding up maps for him, and he was complaining about Stanford not putting enough money into maps. And after that trip, we received a check for $10,000 from one of the participants saying, for heaven's sakes, buy some maps for Uncle Wayne. His most memorable line on that trip, I think, was we arrived at Suzdal to stay in what I thought was a a really desirable place. It was the Pokrovsky Monastery. And he was the first off the bus, went into the hotel facilities at the monastery, and came out huffing and puffing and saying, "They don't have any damn bourbon."
What was it again? Any damn
They don't have any damn bourbon,
bourbon?
which handicapped him for that evening. Our next speaker is David Holloway, who's a professor of political science emeritus, Raymond A. Spruance Professor of International History, and a senior fellow at Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He was co-director of CSAC from 91 to 97, and director of FSI from 98 to 2003. His research focuses on the international history of nuclear weapons, on science and technology in the Soviet Union, and on the relationship between international history and international relations theory. His book, Stalin and the Bomb, The Soviet Union and Atomic Energy, 1939 to 56, Yale University Press, 1994, was chosen by the New York Times Book Review as one of the 11 best books of 1994, and it won the Uncle Wayne Vucinich and the Schulman Prizes of the AAASS, the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies. He also co-edited with Norman Naimark, Re-examining the Soviet Experience, Essays in Honor of Alexander Dallin. That was in 1996. David will talk about Alexander Dallin, scholar and leader.
Thank you very much, Jack. I do feel it a great honor to be asked about to talk about Alex Dallin. And I also do so with some trepidation because I look in front of me, I see Gail, his widow here, with whom he worked so closely. And indeed, I first met Alex. I wasn't a student of his, but I first met him, I think in the late 1970s. We were both going to the same conference, and somebody introduced us, and he looked at me with that somewhat quizzical look he could have and said, "Yes," he said, "I've been reading some of your material." And I was waiting, yes, and that was it. So, and I couldn't tell from his look whether he thought it's total rubbish, or maybe there's something interesting there, or you are educable. So, but then Gail, you and Alex and I were at the Wilson Center for some months then after that, and that's when I first really got to know him and you. And then later, of course, here as a colleague. So I'm going to do something slightly different from what Norman did. I'll say something about Alex's life and the relationship between his life and the issues that concerned him in his research. So he was born in Berlin in 1924. His mother was from Odessa, and she had come to Berlin to study music. And while in Berlin, she met Alex's father, her husband, whom she married, and that was David Dallin, who was a leading Menshevik. And on the left of the Menshevik movement. And so Alex was brought up in Berlin I think, in relatively comfortable circumstances in the material sense, but of course for a Jewish family, increasingly threatening circumstances in the 1930s. His parents separated in the mid-30s, but Alex stayed in Berlin with his mother, in fact, until early 1939, which is quite late. And then they escaped to Paris, where Alex went to school for a while. But then, of course, when the war broke out, Alex and his mother moved to the south of France, and they made various attempts to leave France. And there is a whole story of Alex's own perseverance in trying to make sure that they could get him visas to come to the United States. He was still a teenager. I mean, he was 15, 16 years old at the time. And he and his mother, I think it was without his father at the time, or maybe his father was with them, tried to cross the Pyrenees to get into Spain, but were turned back by the border guards. But eventually managed to get to Lisbon and catch a boat to New York in November of 1940. And he went to George Washington High School, graduated from there, went to City College, and then in 1943 he was called up and spent much of his military service, given that he had Russian, German, and French, in military intelligence, in interrogating German prisoners of war. And then when he left the army in 1947, he went back to City College, finished his degree there, and then became a graduate student at Columbia. And I think I've dwelt on this very briefly on this part of his biography. I think it's interesting in itself as a kind of story in a time of enormous turmoil. But it also shaped, I think, the kinds of issues that he studied. After all, his life itself had been shaped by great events of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution, the rise of Nazism, World War II. And those were the issues that he really grappled with in his research. And those were at least for Europe and the United States and the Soviet Union, the dominant issues throughout the 20th century. So those were the things that he engaged with. And I think that his own experience, as I'll try to suggest later, affected the way in which he understood broad historical trends and broad historical events. He published his masterpiece, German Rule in Russia, 1941 to 1945, in 1957 when he was 33. And that really established him immediately as a leading historian of the Soviet Union and indeed of Nazi Germany. It is a remarkable book. I heard him later talk about the pain and the suffering he went through in writing it. I think sitting in a warehouse in Washington with captured German documents for 3 or 4 years to put it together. But it's actually a masterpiece of history writing, very precise in detail. It's very readable because individuals are brought out as characters, and yet encompassing this really horrendous story of German and Nazi rule in the Soviet Union. So it's a combination of a great sweep of an enormously important historical event with a great ability to bring it alive by focusing on individuals. And I think was recognized immediately as a landmark book. In the same year, he published a book about the occupation of Odessa. I mean, it's astonishing the work that he did early on. And after that, he turned increasingly to the study of the Soviet Union and the study of Soviet politics, the study of East-West relations, and the study of international communism. He didn't entirely abandon his interest in the war, of course. The second edition of his book on German rule was published in the 1980s, and I actually went back to look at the kind of afterword he wrote for the second edition, and again was struck by his enormous reading and his discussion of the new literature that had come out between the mid-50s and the mid-80s on the kinds of issues that he was dealing with. And Norman and Alex and I organized a conference in 1991 on Operation Barbarossa. And this was the first conference to bring together Soviet, German, British, and American historians of Operation Barbarossa. And we were able to get, I think, everyone we invited. It was an extremely interesting meeting. And I think, frankly, that it was Alex's reputation as a historian of the war that made that possible. His work was known, of course, in the Soviet Union to those who could get access to the book, and in Germany. And maybe the fact that we held a conference in Bellagio also attracted people to come. Now, when I made a note of that last night as I was preparing these remarks, I thought, oh, that's a very Alex type of remark, you know, because he was self-deprecating in the sense that if he wouldn't try to puff himself up or, you know, claim everything was his due to him or to his credit. And he was also deprecatory about others. I think he could be sardonic. He could be, and he had made strong judgments about people. But I think he had a sense of his own value, his own knowledge, his own worth as a scholar. But it never came across as egotism. It was always serious, and he was serious about the issues that he was researching. So I put in the title of my talk, Scholar, and that's what I think he was. He was a very serious and important scholar in our field. So by the late 1950s, he was a professor of political science at Columbia. He became a full professor in 1961. He directed the Russian Institute, later the Harriman Institute, there for 5 years in the 1960s. And then he joined the faculty here at Stanford in 1971. And Bert already mentioned some of the background to that. He came out for a year up on the hill at Casbus at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. Liked California, as so many people who come out to spend a year there do, and stayed at Stanford half-time, as Bert explained, half-time in the history department, half-time at Hoover, and then for reasons I don't, or for I think reasons I understand, but I don't know the details, he quit his appointment at Hoover, and then he became joint history and political science. So he had that. He was the director of Crease twice, and he was a good administrator, I think, and a good fundraiser for Crease. He did, like Uncle Wayne, but with a very different style. He managed to put Crease on a sound footing. But his influence was much more than, you know, occupying the position of director of Crease. He was a major figure in the field of Soviet and East European studies. He was one of the dominant figures from the 1950s through to his death in the year 2000. And that was a time when the field was being formed. Bert again mentioned Stanford was unusual in having a Russian center before World War II. It's really a field that develops in the context of the Cold War. And Alex was one of the dominant figures in shaping the field, in directing the Russian Research Center at, the Russian Institute rather, at Columbia, but also in his activities here. I don't think there was a national committee in the field that he wasn't, an important national committee in the field that he wasn't a member of during that whole period. His influence was really quite pervasive, and he was president of what used to be the AAASS in 1984, 1985. I remember rather clearly the fact that in the 1980s, when we got Russian visitors more than we had before, when things were, and I know George Breslauer will talk about this. I mean, it was a fantastic period for anyone studying the Soviet Union as things began to open up. And I remember that Alex, as a senior figure in the field and very widely respected in Russia too, that we had some extremely interesting visitors. I remember one evening sitting in your house, Gail, up near Hoover House, where Sergo Mikoyan came, and it was 1986 rather. I remember very clearly, because he said, yes, Gorbachev is thinking about releasing Sakharov from Gorky. So we were getting this kind of information coming through these contacts. Another visitor, Alexander Yakovlev, came, remember, to talk about the changes taking place. And Alex was, I think, a focal point because of his scholarship and his role as a leader in the field and organizer. So scholar and kind of leader were the two terms I wanted to apply to him. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he again, his organizational skills were in play. He played a role in, an important role in setting up the European University in St. Petersburg. Was involved in that. And he also, with Condi Rice, set up the scheme of new democracy fellowships that we had here for some years, bringing students from the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe here to do PhDs in the social sciences. Alex saw the study of the Soviet Union not as a question of confirming an already held point of view, but rather a matter of seeking to understand a complex and changing reality. I think he was the first person from whom I heard the term essentialism and criticism of essentialism in the analysis of the Soviet Union, that it was essentially something or other, meaning it wasn't really changing and wasn't changeable. It was essentially totalitarian or essentially Russian. So he wasn't one of the people who would quote the Marquis de Custine to explain Soviet society. What interested him, I think, greatly was change, or rather, through the Brezhnev years, the possibility of change. And change brought about by the action of human beings. So he didn't, as it were, deprive the Russians of agency. He didn't think, oh, Russians are just playing out a script that was written centuries ago. You know, that's Russia, so these are the roles that people are assigned and will play. Even though, of course, people might be. So his view was, no, change would come because people did make decisions, they could take actions, even, of course, in very constrained circumstances. Even if they were the victims of historical events or victims of the cruel exercise of power. And my sense was that sense of the importance of individuals and action came maybe from his own youth, his own childhood, but also from his involvement in the interview project run by Harvard. So he spent some time I think based in Munich, interviewing Russians who were displaced people after the end of the war. And this was a project to try to get an understanding of what Soviet society was like, since social scientists couldn't actually go there in the Stalin years to investigate that. So you could investigate certain things by interviewing people who, for one reason or another, had found themselves outside the Soviet Union at the end of the war. And I think that was a characteristic of his approach to thinking about the Soviet Union. And I mentioned that he was in both departments, political science and history. And I think his approach to political science was very much tempered by his study of history. He was suspicious of kind of large models like totalitarianism that didn't accommodate change or ruled out, as it were, even the looking for change. And in a way, his counterpart, who took a very different view, was Martin Melia over at Berkeley. For Alex, political science was the discipline in which one could raise large questions about political systems, such as the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. I was a colleague of Alex's for 10 years in political science. I joined the history department after he had retired, so I didn't see him operate in that context. But there were serious divisions in our political science department in the 80s and 90s about the nature of political science. What was political science? Actually, every political science department I've been in has had disagreements over what the nature of political science is. And one of the issues was, of course, what came to be called area studies. And there was one notorious example, which I didn't hear myself, but was quoted to me by several of my colleagues in political science, where one member of the department had said, "Oh, you people interested in Soviet Union and China, you're kind of real estate people. If you want to understand politics, study politics in San Jose. Politics is politics. Why should we be interested in the Soviet Union or China or Western Europe or Latin America?" And I think that's extremely important, because that's why Crease was so important. Crease was a place where you could bring people who knew about Russia, Eastern Europe, now Eurasia, and bring people from different disciplines. And actually, when I was very briefly the responsible dean for the humanities, I used to worry about where is knowledge about other societies actually to be found in the university. Social science disciplines have basically said, no, that's not of interest to us. And this was, I think, worse then than it is now. So that's why the Encina Commons now and Crease and the other area study centers are so important to the university. And I think Alex, both as director and both as somebody very much involved in Crease, he understood that and understood just how important it was. And for anyone, for all of us, I think, who were, interested in the region, absolutely. To think of Stanford without Crease would be, it would be a much poorer place. So I think that, sorry, got a little bit heated about that. The style of writing, Alex, though he was in two departments, you wouldn't say, oh, here's his history writing, here's his political science. The two were really seamless. And I think one consequence of the merging, in a way, of the two disciplines in his writing is both his deep research, his careful formulation of arguments, but also in a way that raise large questions and engage with interesting ideas. He had a great sense of humor. He was very witty in a sometimes sardonic way. When I first came to the US, I thought, and got to know Alex, I thought, oh, that's a very European point of view. It's less puffery and a more realistic view of the world. He didn't suffer fools gladly. He didn't puff himself up, and he didn't like to see other people do that either. So my final point I want to make is, how would he think about the field today? Which is a big question. First of all, I think he would be astonished by the range of research that's become possible, the access to materials, the kinds of studies that could be done that were just inconceivable before the late 1980s. And he would have been delighted by that, and he began to exploit those opportunities right at the end of his life, when he co-edited a book of the documents from, or correspondence from, Georgy Dimitrov. He would have been dismayed by the way in which things have turned out in Russia. He wrote an essay in 1994 called "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" Already, bemoaning, well, not bemoaning, but regretting the changes or the failure of our expectations, or expectations of Democrats to be realized. I think he would have been dismayed by the toxic quality of some of our discussions about Russia today. He had disagreements with people like Melia, but I think it was always on a very civilized basis. I think he would still have been suspicious of large models or theories of systems that seek to explain everything. And he would have stressed, I think, that what we are studying, and we are scholars, so that is what our role is, what we are studying is a complex and changing reality, and that's important to bear in mind. And he would have still resisted, I think, essentialist analyses of, oh, well, we know what the Russians are like, or we know whatever. So on that point, thank you very much.
I remember fondly the Alex years. Gail, in your house, I think Alex was partly responsible for helping get the Rockefeller grant of $1 million for the Berkeley-Stanford Program in International Behavior. About 10 years, that money paid for visiting scholars. It paid for transportation of grad students between the two campuses. And when it was Stanford's turn, about monthly, we consumed a lot of chips and dip at your house, Gail, with Alex. And Alex was not one to grow and celebrate achievements like the Berkeley-Stanford Program grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. He promptly turned to the administration and said, we need more money to recognize, to back up this recognition we've gotten from the Rockefeller Foundation. So he didn't rest on the achievement. He turned around and said, we need, for example, a position in the economics department on the Soviet economy. We got that, but then the department eventually absorbed it for other purposes. But anyway, he was always thinking strategically. And those years meeting in his house with 20, 30, I think as many as 40 people from the two campuses discussing important